of comments from you on this one. Miles says, Lee Anderson is right and wrong. I think most people would support the death penalty for people like Carrick and child abusers and murderers. At the same time, most of us are all too aware that sometimes the system gets things wrong. And it's that latter point as to why it, well, one of the many reasons why it doesn't exist anymore. Channing says Lee Anderson is everything that is right with our system, plain talking and speaking the language of the average person. It's only the liberal intelligentsia that step in and stop common sense from prevailing. Speaking of which, Chris Daw KC, barrister, writer, broadcaster, is with us. Afternoon to you, Chris.
Afternoon.
You are the liberal intelligentsia, is that right?
I thought that was you, Ian.
Is that right?
Every time I listen to your programme, I'm thinking just that.
Absolutely, yes. It's like a verbal edition of The Guardian. I know exactly what you're saying.
Well, next time I'm in, I might bring you a T-shirt with liberal intelligence.
That would be interesting.
Anyway.
So listen, here's Lee Anderson. He's not speaking for his party. He's speaking in a personal capacity. He's a tell-it-like-it-is politician. He's now the deputy chair of the Conservative Party. I'm sure Rishi Sunak is discombobulated in a cupboard somewhere at number 10. But what he said has a lot of support. What's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with it is that wherever the death penalty is practiced, anywhere in the world, it causes catastrophic injustice and the death of innocent people. I was involved in a case involving the murder of a young woman called Lynette White on Valentine's Day in 1989 in Cardiff. Lynette White's murder was investigated and 5 black men were placed on trial for her murder. And 3 of those men were convicted and given life sentences. And probably Lee Anderson would say quite right that she was stabbed 60 times or thereabouts. And it was one of the most horrific murders I've ever been involved in. The only problem is those 3 black men were completely innocent. And so according to Lee Anderson, they should be dead. Thankfully, they're not, because we don't have the death penalty, because 4 or 5 years later, it transpired that they'd been wrongly convicted. And about 10 years after that, DNA proved that the murder was committed by a single white man. Called Jeffrey Gafour, who is serving life imprisonment for her murder. So 3 completely innocent black men went on trial for murder. If we had the death penalty, they would be dead.
Well, but they might not be, Chris, because I think you sort of answered another question there, perhaps inadvertently. DNA, which didn't exist in the same way then, it does now. There are other measures in place. That's the game changer, isn't it? That's where this argument that, well, you might get the wrong person. We can be more sure now than ever before.
No, it very much depends on whether there is DNA evidence. There isn't always DNA evidence in murder cases, but even if there is, that doesn't categorically prove that someone's committed a murder. DNA or cellular material, whether it be skin or blood or any other kind of bodily substance, can be transmitted secondhand by secondhand contact. So the fact that, that there is DNA recovered, it's important evidence, and it may be important in proving that someone's alibi is incorrect or something like that, but it's far from proving conclusively that someone committed a murder.
True, but that along with other factors, I mean, if you discover that the DNA is in the right place and clearly it could only have got there because somebody did X, Y, and Z, and then you can put that along with other forensic information at the crime scene, you'd have to have a criteria that you'd have to hit. And surely there would be a point where any sensible person would say, right, OK, whether you think of the death penalty, right, I mean, at the moment, we send people to jail for 30, 40 years based on this stuff. So it's not as if you get away with it. You still get convicted. And the reason you do is because we are now very confident about the process, the forensic process.
That's not the case at all. We've always had the same standard of proof in this country, which is proof beyond reasonable doubt that someone committed the crime. So every single person who's convicted of murder or any other crime is convicted on the basis that they've been proved guilty beyond reasonable doubt, whether it involves
But that reasonable doubt is now stronger, surely, because of the introduction of DNA and forensics and the advances in that area.
No, I don't agree.
It must be. Come on, you're a barrister, Chris. You must know that. You must see things in court that you didn't see in 1989, 99 or whatever that you can see today.
Well, I wasn't qualified in 1989.
Fair point, but you take the point.
Young for that, but certainly I qualified in the early days of DNA evidence in the mid-1990s when it was really just becoming used in criminal investigation and criminal prosecutions. I think, frankly, we can split this up into 2 different things. It doesn't matter what kind of evidence is available, what technology is available. Nothing is certain in this world other than the fact that a certain proportion of people convicted of crimes are innocent of those crimes, whether it be 1%, 2%, 10%, a certain percentage of all convicted people who are in prison to this day are in fact innocent, and the system got it wrong. And the problem with the death penalty is that, unlike the sentences you've described of 30 or 40 years, there's no way back from the death penalty, even when it transpires that someone totally... I'm sorry, but if it was my son Ian, or my daughter, or anybody I knew, or indeed anyone I didn't know, who was wrongly and convicted and innocent and was put to death by the state, I can't think of anything that says something appalling about society than killing innocent people.
So you have and that's largely a separate point. We'll come back to that. But if you have the obvious serial killer example, that DNA appears at every crime scene. It appears intimately at every crime scene. Other forensics corroborate that. Footprints, fingerprints, hair, goodness knows what else, discarded cigarette butt. Then you'd have to be away with the fairies not to conclude that this is a 100%er, surely.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a 100%er, Ian. There are very strong cases.
There
aren't. And not least because...
and the person says, I did it, yes. I mean, that's 100%.
Well, even that, confessions. In fact, in the case I mentioned at the beginning, in the Lynette White murder case, one of the men did, in fact, confess, one of the innocent men, and he confessed because the police put so much pressure on him over so many days that he lost the will to resist and just said, OK, if you say I did it, I must have done it. And that's, in the end, people do confess. Many, many cases involve false confessions by people who are just, you're forgetting another element to a crime, Ian, which is that the mental element of a crime. Many crimes are committed by people who have severe psychiatric illness, which in fact affords them a defence and shows that they are suffering from insanity or some other serious condition, which makes it impossible for them to form the intent to commit the crime. Are we going to kill those people? Are we going to kill people with serious psychiatric conditions?
There would be exemptions, naturally, would there not? I mean, Mr. Anderson mentioned Lee Rigby as a case, which was almost a televised execution in the street.
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is this. I'm afraid that Mr. Anderson is just trying to appeal to a particular kind of part of the electorate that really is looking for blood and violence and revenge at every opportunity. The truth is that if you look at the countries that practice the death penalty, they're not safer, better places to live. Does anyone really want to go live in Chicago amongst all the bullets flying everywhere where they have the death penalty? What good does that do? Look at Saudi Arabia, China, all of the countries that have the death penalty.
But they're out of control rogue regimes, aren't they? A man got executed in China for cattle rustling not so many years ago, for goodness sake. But I get that. But somebody like Lee Rigby, you wouldn't execute the Lee Rigby killers.
I wouldn't execute anyone ever because I'm a human being.
You don't even like jailing them, Chris, to be fair, do you?
I don't believe in killing people. I don't believe it's a civilized way to behave for anybody. Killing people deliberately as part of the apparatus of a civilized modern society. Frankly, the death penalty should have died a death itself hundreds of years ago.
Let me read you this from June, who says, since the 1960s, the liberal establishment have called this one incorrectly. But they don't seem to understand is that having capital punishment is the ultimate sentence makes our society progressive, not regressive. We've been living in an upside-down world thinking for decades now. She's onto something there, isn't she? Actually, you're convinced it's regressive, but actually for many people, Lee Anderson included, actually this is the right thing to do for a good society. Why do you want to spend 40-odd thousand quid a year sticking somebody, Carrick or somebody like that, in jail for 30, 40 years?
Well, the reason is because we're a civilized modern society that doesn't...
But why is that more civilized than saying, I'm very sorry? You don't have to have a dance and a party and let off fireworks. You could say, I'm sorry, but you've rendered yourself surplus to the human gene pool by the barbarity of the kind of crimes you've committed. Therefore, we are going to take the decision quietly, not publicly. You will be taken to a place, as the guy with the cap on his head used to say, and you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead, etc. Why is that a regressive move? What is so upsetting about that, Chris?
Well, because, let's separate out into two things, okay? If there are those amongst us who, and I know there are millions of people who believe that killing people in this way is right and justified and should happen, okay? If that's your moral belief and that's the direction of your moral compass, then so be it. You're entitled to that view. I personally find the entire idea utterly amoral that a society and a government, not someone in the spur of the moment or someone suffering from sort of psychiatric illness or someone on drugs or someone who's done sort of an act of terrible barbarity and violence and caused death in those circumstances, but the entire country deciding as a matter of policy to put people to death. I find it repulsive, disgusting, and something from another era, hundreds if not thousands of years ago, where it should have remained. So let's put that to one side, because they're different moral arguments, okay? But let's look at something even more important in my view. And of course, if you're prepared to accept that a certain number of innocent people are going to be executed, there's absolutely no way around that. That happens in every society on earth. If you're accepting the death of innocent people as the price to be paid for your absolute crushing desire for vengeance, then so be it. You take that moral position and you argue it, and we'll see what comes out of the political process. But for me, much more importantly, is the death penalty does not deter crime or reduce violent crime.
Doesn't have to be about deterrent, though, does it?
The death penalty
I agree with you on that.
Money. Death penalty, the death row process, which inevitably, I'm assuming even those who argue it are not saying they should be taken out and hanged at the back of the court without even an appeal or without any possibility of their conviction being overturned by new evidence coming to light later. But so let's assume that people are at least accepting that people are entitled to have an appeal against the death penalty. Then that process inevitably takes years, if not decades, in order to do justice to it, and that costs far more than keeping people in prison for the rest of their lives for the most violent people overall. The death penalty, the death row inmates in the States cost the country millions and millions. And in the end, many of them are not in fact executed because of some legal reason or another. The death penalty, in effect, is a complete and utter waste of money. It's morally repugnant, and it does not reduce a single crime on the streets. That's why the United States, that has the death penalty, that practices it in large numbers, has the highest murder rate on earth.
Chris Daw, thank you. Chris Daw KC, broadcaster, barrister and author, with us here on Talk TV.